Greetings everyone. This is a quick promo before the video begins. If you're new to the channel and you didn't know it yet, I am actually an author in addition to being a YouTuber, and I have 2 books that you can get on Amazon. Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1 and The Occult Mafia. The first is sort of a bizarre, absurdist kaiju anime mashup, and the other is a horror noir story with a hint of a western thrown in there. They're both set in the same universe, and at this point have received mostly positive reviews, so you might want to check them out. I've provided Amazon links for both of them down in the description. They're both available in either paperback or Amazon Kindle, and Operation Red Dragon is also available in audiobook form. So if either of these strike your fancy and you want to support a struggling artist, feel free to go down and check out either one or both of them. Alright, the shameless self-promotion is out of the way, we can get on with the video. Thank you all for your support. Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am the Omni viewer, and welcome to this special Halloween edition of Genre Benders, Obscurities, and Flawed Gems, where we look at the best stuff you've never heard of. I had to ask myself a very difficult question recently. How could I have been a child of the 90s who grew up liking both cartoons and the classic Universal monsters, yet I'd never heard of Monster Force before this year?
I mean, I'm usually the guy who knows all about the little-known works that deserve more love than they got, yet this 1994 series never blipped on my radar, and I don't know how I missed it. Well, as soon as I did learn about it, I knew that I had to check it out, and having done that, I now have to share my thoughts on it because that's what I do.
Here's the pitch. Universal Monsters, the animated series. And I mean that literally.
This isn't like Monster Squad, which pays homage to the Universal monsters but was produced by a different studio and features lawyer-friendly representations of the monsters. No, Monster Force is a legitimate Universal production based on those versions of the characters. Sure, anyone can use Dracula and the Frankenstein monster, but only Universal can use a werewolf with the surname Talbot, as this show does.
But what is it about? And more importantly, is it any good? That's what we're going to find out.
The story is set in the year 2020, when evil supernatural forces lurk in every corner of the world.
You see, things really could be worse.
Collectively known as the Creatures of the Night, despite not being an official team, such horrors as Dracula, the Mummy, and the Creature from the Black Lagoon are stepping out of the shadows to prey upon mankind. Standing against them is Monster Force, who serve as a futuristic take on the Ghostbusters. The team has 6 members: Dr. Reed Crawley, team founder and scientist who has a personal history with Dracula; Trip Hansen, the self-confident to the point of cockiness martial artist; Lance Magruder, the reserved and inquisitive weapons specialist; Shelley Frank, the compassionate psychic; Luke Talbot, the good-natured, somewhat nerdy young man who inherited the curse of the Wolfman from his grandfather Lawrence; and the Frankenstein monster, who I'm sure you know by reputation.
He's called Frank in the series, and if it's all the same to you guys, I'll be calling him that as well for the remainder of the video.
As a united front, they use a mixture of science and magic, as well as their energized monster armed containment suits, or EMACs, to keep the forces of evil at bay.
I'm going to be upfront with you guys about this. Monster Force is the very definition of a flawed gem. Emphasis on the word flawed. The 90s were a great time for dramatic action cartoons, many of which have aged splendidly, but in the case of Monster Force, I should tell you not to expect something in the vein of Batman or Gargoyles, or heck, even Sonic the Hedgehog.
Visually, the animation is pretty solid, but frequently has moments that look very awkward. Sometimes it's because the characters are awkwardly standing or shifting in place waiting for the right moment to move, and sometimes it's just the result of errors that naturally occur in hand-drawn animation. Some have no excuse at all, like this close-up of Lance from the second episode where he suddenly looks like a totally different person. The series was clearly made on a budget, and that is painfully obvious.
The characters comprising the Monster Force team also suffer from not having much substance. Those baseline descriptions I gave you are about as complex as any of them get.
Dr. Crawley is the most interesting, being the seasoned monster hunter and leader of the team. Trip and Lance, however, barely display any personality differences most of the time, and Shelley suffers the same fate as so many animated action women of the 90s by being the girl, with little else to make her stand out. As for Luke and Frank, Well, we'll get to them in a moment, but the rest of the team is very generic as main characters go. Combine all of that with some occasionally cringe-inducing dialogue, and you've got a very imperfect piece of animation.
I just wanted to get that out of the way first and foremost, because I don't want to oversell Monster Force as some kind of masterpiece. It's clearly not. Yet despite its flaws, I still find myself enjoying it and recommending it to anyone who likes the Universal monsters. Why would I say that if it's so heavily flawed? Well, there are several reasons, starting with the handling of the series itself.
Like I said earlier, Monster Force is not quite on the same level of quality as other action cartoons of the 90s, but that's still the standard it's aiming for. The showrunners appear to have understood that they were working in the horror genre, and despite insistence from the network to remain family-friendly, they don't shy away from that aspect.
Alright, the show doesn't actually show anyone dying, or even say the word die, but it also doesn't pretend that the monsters aren't killers.
The danger of the situation is always real, even if it's not explicit, and while it may feel restrained compared to its contemporaries, that does speak to the crew at least making a valiant effort.
As far as I'm concerned, the real litmus test for this show is the handling of the monsters themselves. Not every one of the Universal monsters makes it into the series. The Invisible Man and the Phantom of the Opera are noticeably absent, but the ones who do show up really get their dues. For the most part, anyway.
Luke Talbot, unfortunately, is the weakest of the bunch, which is a shame because he actually started out very strong. The first episode of the series, which introduces us to everything without being an origin story, focuses on Luke being kidnapped by Dracula and his brides, as well as Drax's henchman Renfield. Dracula plans to keep Luke in a cage until the rise of the full moon, at which point Luke will lose control of his abilities and become a ravenous monster, thus making him more susceptible to the Count's control. This is the closest the series comes to depicting Luke's lycanthropy the way his grandfather Lawrence Talbot experienced it in the classic movies.
From that description, you might think Luke Talbot is going to be like the Incredible Hulk of the team. A nice guy who wants to help, but whose powers render him an uncontrollable monster. However, that concept doesn't even last halfway through the second episode.
In that adventure, Luke states that he can't describe what it's like to be a Wolfman because rational thought flees his mind when he transforms. But he seems to have total control of his mind and body for the rest of the episode. From that point on, his lycanthropy is just a superpower that he can switch on and off like a light. This reeks of executive meddling, and it's really a shame that this reimagined Wolfman turns out to be the weak link of the group. The antagonist werewolf, named Bella in reference to the original film, fares much better. He's an older gent who seems amicable at first, but all he wants is to form his own lycanthropic pack. To do this, he needs an artifact that any classic horror fan should recognize on sight.
Yes, the wolf-headed cane from the original film is brought back, but it too is reinterpreted.
In the original film, it's a normal cane with a silver handle that both foreshadows Lawrence's fate and serves as the cruelly ironic instrument of his death. Here, the cane is a mystical device that gives its wielder control over other werewolves. Surprisingly, Bella succeeds in obtaining it by the episode's end, but due to the show's early cancellation, we never see the full extent of where this plot thread could have gone.
Thank God that Frank gets better treatment.
Frank straddles the line between the Universal version and original novel version. Visually, he's the Universal Frankenstein monster if he got a gym membership. As a character, he's presented as a well-meaning, fairly intelligent fellow who swoops in to save the day when the rest of the team is outmatched.
He rarely speaks, and how he speaks depends on the situation.
In calmer times, Frank is pretty articulate, but urgency will have him resort to his standard fire bad friend good speech to save time.
It is home. You will not harm Shelley. Luke, not monster.
Perhaps his coolest feature is the ability to absorb electricity and weaponize it. That doesn't happen too often, but when it does, it's pretty cool.
Most of the monsters are villains, though, the chief of which, naturally, is Dracula.
The King of Vampires is the arch-enemy of Monster Force. Most of the time he's a scheming puppet master, but he's got more than enough power to make him a physical threat. He has a menacing air about him befitting of his legacy, and he's so ruthless that he'll even betray his fellow vampire lords for his own gain. It takes a lot of effort to take him down, so even though he always loses, he remains threatening through it all.
Unfortunately, the voice actor didn't even attempt a Transylvanian accent, which is really too bad, because the performance is at just the right level of ham that an accent would have graduated it to Virginia Smokehouse.
A monster? Moi?
I bid you welcome,
You are very definitely a monster.
children of the night. What music they make.
Renfield is constantly at Dracula's side as the #1 henchman. Here he's portrayed as a combination of Renfield and Igor, and mostly serves as comic relief, though thankfully not the annoying kind. His role is fairly minimal compared to the rest, though.
Then, of course, we have the mummy Imhotep, or just Hotep as the show calls him.
Hotep's introductory episode sees him fight Dracula in one of the show's better scenes. From there, it plays out like a more action-oriented remake of the original film. Indeed, it's similar enough that I would call it a good introduction to the character for a younger audience. His interaction with Dracula is one of the few hints at an overarching story in which all of the monsters would eventually be united, but the show's early cancellation prevented that from ever playing out.
Personally, though, I was most curious to see how they would handle the Gill Man. Creature from the Black Lagoon is my favorite of the Universal monster movies, so naturally the Gill Man is my favorite Universal monster, and I had very high hopes for how Monster Force would handle him.
The episode connects the Gill Man, here simply called the Creature, to an ancient sunken city in the ocean, so he's not really from the Black Lagoon anymore, but what's in a name?
What matters is the presentation, and Monster Force delivers.
The creature is depicted as nothing less than a force of nature, quite possibly the most powerful monster on the whole show. No weapon on Monster Force's arsenal can do anything but briefly slow him down, and even Luke is unable to inflict any damage. Heck, he's even implied to have dragged that sunken city underwater by himself.
Moreover, the creature isn't really the villain of the episode.
Yes, he's dangerous and needs to be contained, but the real villain is a greedy archaeologist who wants to claim the sunken city's treasure for himself, thereby unleashing the creature's wrath.
The creature walks among us!
This lines up nicely with the movies, believe it or not.
The creature films are somewhat subversive in how they depict the scientists as the real monsters. They invade the creature's home, dump poisonous chemicals into the water, capture him and put him on display in a saltwater tank, and perform transformative cosmetic surgery on him after lighting him on fire. The creature lashes out, sure, but there's always an underlying sense that he's somewhat justified in doing it. That carries over into Monster Force, only with a hint of influence from Godzilla as the creature becomes the consequence of man's hubris. Really, the only issue I have with the Monster Force creature is that he occasionally has a protruding fang from his mouth that makes him look buck-toothed. It's not in every shot, but when it shows up, it makes him look doofy. Still, it's a minor issue compared to everything they get right.
And that's the bottom line, really. Monster Force gets the Universal monsters right, or at least as right as it can.
Again, it's obvious that the show had restrictions put on it, with thematic lines that couldn't be crossed and designs that had to be toyetic.
However, the showrunners were not so focused on what they weren't allowed to do that they lost sight of what they were allowed to do.
These guys clearly understood the legacy they were contributing to, and they strove to portray the monsters in a way that respected that legacy while also introducing them to a brand new audience. You see, it's not that hard to do, Polygon!
It really is a shame that the show didn't last beyond its first season, and even more of a shame that only half of that season is available on DVD.
Again, it's far from a perfect cartoon, but I count it as a worthy entry in the Universal Monsters series. In fact, I think Universal should use it as the template for rebooting the monsters on film.
Rather than just keep making crappier versions of things that were already great, take this cartoon and improve upon it.
It's got a good foundation and a better understanding of the concept than that Tom Cruise movie ever did, so it's worth taking a shot. The worst that could happen is they pump out another flop and need to reboot it again in a few years. Universal should be used to that by now, so there's no reason not to try.
It's unlikely that's ever going to happen, though. But at least we still have the original Monster Force to enjoy. And I do find myself enjoying it, warts and all. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omni Viewer signing off. By the way, I would kill to have that action figure of the creature in my collection. Well, I would mortally wound for it. Injure, lightly bruise, declare a thumb war, whatever. I'd like it as part of my collection.
If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Like and subscribe, then go down to the description to find links to follow us on DeviantArt, Patreon, and Twitter. While you're there, you'll also find the Amazon links for the original novels Operation Red Dragon, The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, and The Occult Mafia. 2 books I think you'll really enjoy. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.